Good morning, good morning, good morning. Took me a little longer to get up here. I wanted to come up to probably the most special place on Lanai, Sweetheart Rock. It takes an extra 15 minutes to get up here. Because this morning, I'm talking about lessons I learned from my mom. So, special broadcast. Good morning, Richard Bliss Brooke. I wonder who that is. Hey, Bobby. So, if those of you that follow my sister, which probably most of you don't, probably noticed last Wednesday my mom passed away. And I don't do the in-the-moment drama and trauma social media posts. Not because I think there's anything wrong with them. For people that want to do that, I think it's great. I don't do it because it tends to elicit the "I'm so sorry" response from people, and so I don't need that, and my mom doesn't need it, and I just have a different attitude about death. Some deaths are untimely and some deaths are tragic. But my mom lived to be 91 and a half years old, which is a pretty good run for somebody as reckless as she was. And she lived at least 88 of those years on her own terms. The last 3 years, she was locked down in a memory facility with a bunch of zombies. And she did not like that. And they kept her drugged up like a parade horse, which is the only reason I guess she tolerated it, because if she ever got off her meds, she would just break the door down and escape. Well, she did a few times escape, and the cops and the dog catcher had to go get her. So I wanted to dedicate this broadcast to my mom and what I learned from her, and talk a little bit about generational education, because it kind of ties into the work that I do as a coach and working with people on transformation and breakthroughs. And so here's a perspective. And by the way, I'm not looking at your comments, but just in case you're tempted to say condolences, I'm so sorry, don't. How about flip it and go for celebration, all right? The woman lived 88 years on her own terms, which I will describe to you. And she coasted across the finish line the last 3 years. Not so much on her own terms, but hey, if you're all doped up, I guess you don't know the difference, right? So this is a celebration of life and death, and it's not a "I'm so sorry." Here's a perspective. This is the intellectual part of her memorial, if you will. If you think about our parents, and you think about, well, how much did we learn from our parents? How much of who we are came from our parents? And it's a question that I get deep into in coaching people, is ask people, like, well, where did you learn that? Who'd you learn that from? Your mom, your dad? Sometimes it's your grandmother, your grandfather. Sometimes it's a teacher. But usually it's a parent that we learn something from. And what could we learn from a parent? Well, we could learn racism. And I'm not talking about your parents sitting you down and saying, let's talk about the other races and how we're going to get them. No, it's just a state of being, right? Just an attitude, just a casual slang, slip of the tongue. And I was certainly raised a racist, for sure. And yet, if you know somebody or somebody works with you and they're of a different race, that's different, right? But those people out there, racism is learned. Attitudes about money are learned. It's one of the things that, I like get into with people is, where'd you get that attitude about money? And a lot of people that can't bring abundance to their life, it's because their parents confused modesty with humility. Like they taught, hey, you need to be humble, which people would interpret to be, you need to be small, you need to be weak. The weak inherit the earth. I don't know about that. And all those kind of attitudes. And, so one of the lessons, I'll loop some things I learned from my mom in here. One of the things I learned early on from my mom about money was a good thing. Because I just watched my mom manifest money. Not in the traditional way. I don't think she ever had a job where she earned money. But she just manifested it. from other people somehow, right? And what did she do with her money? Well, she bought things that she wanted. And I also learned how those things didn't make her happy, the material things that she bought. I watched her sort of addiction to money not make her happy. But I also learned by watching her, hey, I mean, I learned about some things I didn't know about, right? I never knew about, like I grew up on a ranch, so I knew about cowboy boots, but I knew about dirty old scuffed up cowboy boots that, you know, the barbed wire had carved up. I didn't know anything about $1,200 cowboy boots until my mom decided she had to have, you know, expensive cowboy boots. And a horse to me was just a horse, right? I don't know. People give you horses. You can buy a horse for a couple $100s, right? But no, my mom, she had very expensive horses. And so, you know, I learned from that in two ways. One, I learned, wow, that didn't actually make her happy. In fact, the more things she surrounded herself with materially, perhaps the more unhappy she got. And I was astute enough to observe that. But at the same time, she introduced me to, hey, look at this. Hey, you could have this. Hey, look at this. Hey, the sky's the limit, right? She did that with cars. She did that with travel. She did that with things. I learned some of the good and the bad things about abundance from my mom. And so here's the intellectual perspective that I'm inviting you to all think about. So what I learned from my mom, and my dad's a totally different story. He died like 31, 32 years ago. And I learned a great deal from him in a totally different way. But so I learned from my dad and I learned from my mom, and so did you. But then you have to ask the perspective, well, who did they learn from? Like, where did they get their attitudes? Where did they decide about money and abundance? Where did they decide about race? Where did they decide about work ethic? Where did they decide about being an entrepreneur versus being an employee? Where did they decide about discipline in raising kids? Where did they decide about communication, open communication? Where did they decide about love and connection? So, for example, and I'm not like crying woe here, I'm just sharing this with you because some of you might identify, neither one of my parents, to my recollection, it's just a recollection, ever told me that they loved me until they were dying. And so I think about, well, okay, now some people like, oh, they didn't love me, they didn't care. Well, that's not true at all. I never had that interpretation. It's just an interesting observation, but as I got older and started looking at, you know, how we learn things, I started looking at their parents, and I started looking at my dad's parents. And oh my gosh, you know, I spent maybe the first 12 years a lot of time with my dad's father. And I mean, I don't even remember him smiling, right? So why would he ever tell me he loved me or hugged me? Or no, he just gave me chores to do and disciplined me and scolded me. And, you know, he was just a very pompous, cold, wonderful man, but, you know, that's just how he was raised. And my mom's mom, oh my gosh, I was afraid of her, right? She was wonderful and she was harsh. So, okay, now let's go back a generation. This is the intellectual part that fascinates me. Where did my grandfather on my dad's side and my grandmother on my mom's side learn how to parent, how to love, how to hug, how to express themselves, about race, about abundance? Where did they learn that? Well, my grandmother, my mother's mother, learned it from the Hechtels, which are 100% German. And the Hechtels were alive and parenting in the late 1800s in Germany. Think about it. And my dad's grandfather, I don't know much about him, but, you know, these are people that were living in the late 1800s. Think about life in the late 1800s. Think about how hard it was. And so then where did those grandparents and great-grandparents learn to parent and learn their attitudes? From the great-greats. And now we're talking about mid-1800s. And where did they learn? From the great-great-greats. And now we're talking about early 1800s, late 1700s. You just go back 8 or 10 generations, folks, and you're dealing with people that were living, working, breathing in the 1600s. And who were people that lived in the 1600s? People that created genocide without even thinking about it, whether it was Africa or here in the United States or anywhere, right? They ran into a different race of people. They weren't racist. They were murderers. They just took all their land and killed them all. And so, think about the environmental movement, right? So today, if we discovered a new land and it was populated with millions of these beautiful beasts, we would send in the photographers, right? And we would marvel and we would do Netflix documentaries about them. But our ancestors, the people that raised us, when they discovered the buffalo, they killed them all. Every one of them, millions of them. Left giant piles of bones, right? Why? Just for money. So my point is, what we learn from our parents, we in many ways learn from people in the 1600s and 1700s. And guess where they learned their attitudes and beliefs? From people in the 1500s and 1400s. And long back then, if people had different ideas, radical ideas, if people thought about breaking through, leading edge, changing a paradigm, they didn't criticize them on social media. Like today, we get all whacked out if somebody criticizes our position on social media. But in the 1600s, what did they do if you had a radical opinion and you voiced it? They burned you at the stake publicly in downtown on Sunday morning with everybody coming to watch. These are the people that raised us. So I want you to think about that. And then I want you to think about, you have the opportunity in your life because you're living. And as long as you and I are living, we have the opportunity to change. We have the opportunity to break through. We have the opportunity to create a quantum leap in our evolution, in our attitudes, in how we look at the world, how we look at the environment, right? The way our parents looked at the environment, most of them, was as a source of revenue, a source of wealth, an inexhaustible source of wealth. Even looking at the oceans out here, an inexhaustible source of food, fishing, which for most people was not subsistence. For most of our parents, it was about wealth, right? It was about selling fish and making money. And so that's the way our parents looked at the environment. Today, we're a different generation. A lot of us today look at the environment different, but not totally, right? I still have a boat with 2 gas motors, and I go out 2 or 3 times a week. And I fish. I don't need the fish to eat, right? But, if I didn't eat those fish, I would buy fish, and then a commercial fisherman bought the fish, right? But I think in the future, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, our future generations, they're going to cherish the environment because they're going to realize without the environment, we don't have anything. And they're going to make money other ways, not off the environment. And those are the kind of breakthroughs in evolution that I encourage all of us to have. I believe that's what personal development is all about. It's about us looking at the good that we get from our parents, learning from our parents and seeing, okay, those are values that I cherish. Those are values that are valuable. Those are values that are sustainable. Those are values I want my kids to have. And then there are things you might learn from your parents that you don't want to carry on. Don't want to break through. And one of the saddest things that I see in the development of human beings is people that go through their life blindly following the values of their parents. So they just become a knockoff of their parents. Same religion, same abundance mentalities, same attitudes about raising children, same attitudes about race, same attitudes about the economy, same attitudes about politics, same attitudes about the environment. And what happens when we do that? Well, we just keep perpetuating. I mean, if you look back, you would think, would we want to perpetuate the values of the 1600s and 1700s? You would say, absolutely not. That's crazy. We wouldn't want to do that. Well, why would we want to perpetuate the values of today? It's the same thing. It's just relatively different, right? So here's what I learned from my mom. Some things I learned from my mom, she was a fascinating lady. And we had a bit of a love-hate relationship our whole life. But I'm grateful for her fascination. So here's some things I learned from her. I learned boldness from my mom. Those of you that know me well know I don't really have a problem with boldness. And I suspect I didn't get that from my dad. I got that from my mom. And, there's a lot of things she did with boldness that were not good, that were destructive, that were reckless, that were selfish. But I picked up both sides of it. I saw where, wow, that's destructive, that's selfish, that's greedy. And I also saw where, okay, hey, I got to visualize boldness in action. And I learned it from her. And she did some crazy, bold things, adventurous things. When I was in high school, my mom was gone about half the time, traveling all over the world by herself. in the late 60s and early 70s, all over the world. And she'd be gone for weeks, and she would go find these tribes out in the middle of nowhere. Some of them never seen white people before, and she would go hang out with them. And she would travel by herself, but when she got to these countries, she would go like she would go with a small group of people. And, sometimes we didn't hear from her for weeks. We didn't know if she was coming back. Remember, there's no internet, no email, right? No cell phones. Every once in a while we'd get a postcard from some remote beach or mountain village or something. And of course she wrote it like 2 weeks earlier. And, so I learned that from my mom. I learned boldness. I learned courage from my mom, which might be the same as boldness, but boldness is, kind of like how I would like combine that with is my mom was a manifester. I didn't know that word back then. I don't think anybody used that word back then, but if my mom wanted something, which anything, if she wanted to go skiing today, we're all going skiing. She would just manifest it. And, some people call her style of manifesting a bully style, but whatever she wanted, she just would not be denied. So we're going skiing today, and she would be a whirlwind of we're all going skiing. If she wanted to start a new business, she would start a new business. If she wanted to buy something or sell something, she just got it done. I learned that from her, that confidence of whatever you and I want, if we're willing to work for it, and we're willing to have resolve towards it, we're going to get it. And great lessons from her. And of course, I could go on, and I won't because it's my mom. And most of you did not know her. So I could tell you lots of lessons I learned from her. And some of them you probably will see in me. You'll see that boldness, you'll see that courage, you'll see that confidence to manifest things. And some people think I'm a little harsh. I probably got that from my mom. But some people also see my soft side. And, a couple of things my mom did on the soft side, which is I think back on my life, were pretty remarkable things. I broke my leg when I was 12 years old up in Yosemite skiing, and I was in the hospital for 10 days in traction. That's the way they did it back then. And my mom drove 4 hours round trip every day to see me for 10 days. And yet, there were times in my life where I thought I'm going to have to sue my mom because, right, she's like embezzling money from me. So not really, but kind of, right? Family business things that, you look at your mom and you go, really? You're doing that to me? I should sue you. And hey, fascinating experience. I should be so fortunate to be healthy. It's another thing. My mom's cholesterol and her blood pressure were off the charts her whole life. She had a pig valve in her heart for 25 years that had a 10-year lifespan. She just would not be denied whatever she wanted. I should be so fortunate. Kimmy should be so fortunate that I last 88 years. And I'm going to leave you with a funny story, which some of you may think is horrifying, but I think it's just about the funniest thing my mom ever did. So this is only about 11 years ago. I'm actually playing poker in the local Indian casino about 20 minutes from my mom's ranch. I have my own ranch next to my mom, and I have a little home there, and she has a ranch, and she had a home there, and I'm playing poker, and the phone rings, and I think it was my sister. No, and my sister called, and I didn't answer it because I'm playing poker, and then my assistant called, and it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I go, well, if my assistant called, something's up, so I answered the phone, and she says, your mom's in jail. My mom, by the way, was 80. And I said, oh, really? It doesn't totally surprise me. What's she in jail for? Attempted murder. Oh, well, that's interesting. Who did she try to kill? Also didn't totally surprise me. Her ex-husband, who wasn't quite ex yet. They were in the middle of a divorce. And so, I get up from the poker game and I go down to the Madera County Jail, which is just full of crack whores and dealers and the worst people on the planet. And there's my mom, and I wish I would have had a cell phone. The one picture I regret not having in my whole life is my mom in an orange jumpsuit in chains coming to the window to talk to me. They wouldn't let me take my cell phone in to take a picture of her. And so, I go to the place and I say, what's going on here? And she said, well, she shot at your you know, her ex-husband or soon-to-be ex-husband. And I said, okay, well, how do I get her out of here? I said, what? They said, well, it's $1 million bond, which means you have to put up $1 million bond. So I go back in and see my mom, and I said, so Mom, it's $1 million bond to get you out of here, which means you got to spend $100,000. I mean, you got to put up the bond. It's going to cost you 100 grand. You don't get the 100 grand back, by the way. That's gone. You only get the 900 back if you show up for court, right? So we're trying to spring my mom for 100 grand. I said, Mom, do you want to do this? You know, how do you want to do this? You know, we got to put up property or something, right? And she says, no, I'll just stay in here. I met some really nice ladies in here, and when I get out, they're all going to come up for lunch. And I could see these ladies in the background. They're all crack whores and dealers and drug addicts and stuff. Pretty crazy. Anyway, so to make the long story short, the reason my mom's in prison or in jail for attempted murder is her ex-husband or soon-to-be ex-husband was kind of on her ranch, and she didn't want him on her ranch. And so she went down to where she was, and she shot over his head with her shotgun 6 times. And so the next day I'm meeting with the detectives, and I'm trying, you know, what I'm trying to do is get the bail down so it's a reasonable amount of bail. And he said, well, the problem is, I said, why is this $1 million bail? And you know, she's just mad at him. She's just shooting over his head. And he said, well, she reloaded twice, which is premeditated murder. And so we had CSI out at the ranch, like scouring the ranch for pellets. And if they found any pellets behind where my stepdad at the time was sitting, then she'd have gone down for attempted murder because she would have shot at him, but she shot over his head. They never found any pellets. I got her out of jail. And but she did get convicted for reckless endangerment with a firearm. She's a felon. And I'm actually kind of proud of my mom for giving me that kind of memory. And that's where I'll leave it with you. Today was Mom Day. Thank you for indulging me. I'll see you tomorrow.